Garry Tan is the president of Y Combinator, the startup accelerator in Silicon Valley whose 4,000 companies are worth over $600 billion. Garry is a designer, a hacker, and a builder, and he has the most storybook Silicon Valley career I think I've ever seen. Garry started at Palantir, where he made the logo for a company that would ultimately be worth $60 billion. He then started his own company, which he sold for $20 million to Twitter, and his own VC firm that he co-founded with Alexis Ohanian, the founder of Reddit, who is married to Serena Williams. They made that fund incredibly successful, investing in companies like Cruise, Instacart, Coinbase, Flexport, just to name a few. In total, his investments have made Garry the 6th best venture capital investor in the entire world. And now that Garry has taken over as the president of Y Combinator, you might be forgiven for calling his career, well, perfect. He found such great companies, he made such great investments. He's batting 1,000 seemingly in this very notoriously difficult industry. Well, I love Garry's story not because it's perfect, but because, and I mean this in the nicest way, Garry is very good at being lucky. He's good at finding and then capitalizing on low probability but high upside events. In order to make it in Silicon Valley, you have to be lucky, but you also have to be ready. And in that skill, Garry Tan is the master. Even a master must start as an apprentice. Garry grew up in Fremont, California, where he described his family as being a low-income, immigrant, food-insecure household. His father was a foreman in a machine shop, and his mother was a nurse assistant. And Garry was a high-agency, high-intelligence kind of kid. He would go to Barnes & Noble to learn how to code, and even though he couldn't afford the books, he would just read them right there in the store. And he turned those skills that he built into actual money. He went and sold his services by just cold calling people in the yellow pages, and he turned that money into an actual down payment that he helped his parents make on a house. He earned admission to Stanford, and once he graduated, he moved to Seattle for Microsoft, a great job that paid him $72,000 a year. But that first year, right out of college, Garry won the lottery twice, but he didn't cash in his tickets. The first huge opportunity that Garry passed up was from a small company in the Bay Area. They had about 1,000 employees, they were still a private company, and they invited Garry to come down to their offices and interview. He said no. That company was Google. Less than a year after Garry turned down that interview, Google went public at a ridiculous $23 billion valuation. That would have made Garry an instant millionaire at age 22. And if Garry had held on to that $1 million stake all the way to today, it would be worth over $1 billion. But that was only the first of his 2 near misses that year. The second one, Garry calls his $200 million mistake. In 2003, Peter Thiel was a rising star. He had just sold his company PayPal, netting him a cool $55 million. And although nobody knew it yet, he had just made his first $1 billion investment, putting $500,000 into a company called Facebook and buying over 10% of the company. And right after Peter Thiel had lunch with Mark Zuckerberg, he had lunch with Garry Tan, flying him down from Seattle and inviting him to start a new company alongside him. And Garry said no. He even said no after Peter Thiel literally took out a checkbook at dinner, said, "How much do you make? $72,000, and wrote him a check. It was a zero-risk bet for Garry, but he wanted to go back to Microsoft, where he had a stable, understandable career. Garry made it in Seattle for all of 2 years, but in 2005, after Google had IPO'd, he decided to come back and actually take that job at Palantir. He joined as their 10th employee, and he had a chance to make a huge impact on the company. He even designed the logo that Palantir still uses to this day. And that company ultimately became a huge success. Palantir is public now. It's worth over $42 billion. So even though Garry estimates that his reticence to join Palantir in those early days cost him $200 million, given his likely stake in the company, it's hard to think of this as anything but Garry's first success. It's a pretty good example of Garry's ability to put himself in the right place at the right time. That meeting with Peter Thiel, where he pulled out the checkbook, was no accident. Garry actually knew multiple people on that founding team. He knew Joe Lonsdale from his fraternity at Stanford, and he knew Stephen Cohen from growing up with him in California. Garry was an ambitious, talented person, and other ambitious, talented people thought of him as the person they wanted on the team when they were starting their own company. From the outside, it probably seems like venture capital is a pretty luck-driven industry, but that's never how Garry has approached it. His investment in Coinbase is a great example of that. Coinbase is a crypto platform that is now worth over $25 billion. Garry invested $300,000 into that company back in 2012, which has now increased by about 22,000 times over, meaning that Garry's stake is now worth somewhere in the range of $660 million. So was Garry lucky to invest in Coinbase and have it be such a huge success? I mean, sure, but Garry made that luck happen. At the time, Coinbase was building in a new and frankly really sketchy crypto industry. It was not a hot company. Most investors were actually scared away from Coinbase. When they tried to raise a round in the fall of 2012 for $1 million only, they actually failed. But Garry believed in it because he had done the research ahead of time. Back when he worked with Thiel assigned him to read this book that was called The Dollar Crisis. Garry's takeaway was that the dollar might fail given the precarious state of the world economy. And this is a very contrarian belief that not a lot of people believed at the time. What this meant is that Garry took seriously this crazy crypto stuff a full half-decade before the rest of the world. And second, Garry was working in that investment with pre-existing relationships. He didn't meet Brian by sitting across the table with him at a pitch meeting. He knew him from before. Brian was building anti-fraud tools at Airbnb, and Garry knew him from that time. So when Brian reached out to Garry with this exact email asking him for help finding a co-founder, Garry replied on a Sunday 24 hours later, giving him great advice. And then when Brian was trying to get Coinbase into Y Combinator, Garry was actually one of the people that reviewed his application. He gave him a score of infinity, guaranteeing that he would get an interview and get a chance to join the cohort. And then finally, when the investment actually did happen, it wasn't just one investment. There was 3 separate investments over the course of about 6 months. So this was not a crazy one-off happenstance lucky thing. It was a long-term game that Garry played with long-term relationships. And finally, Coinbase wasn't Garry's only bet. Of the 52 investments that Initialized Capital made in 2012, 41 of them were Y Combinator companies where Garry was advising startups. Garry and Initialized Capital invested about $7 million out of that first fund, most of it to Y Combinator companies, and it's very hard to call that luck. Today, Garry is the president of Y Combinator, and that is not something you can call luck at all. It's something he's been preparing for years. I've already talked about Garry's long history with YC, how in 2008 he went through the cohort himself with his first company that he later sold, and then from 2011 to 2015 he was investing and advising companies from YC at the same time. But his story with YC actually starts well before that. In 2008, Garry was 27 years old. He had just left Palantir, he was about to start his own company, he was about to apply to YC. And so he found this series of lectures that YC was putting on called Startup School, and he decided to attend. But Garry is not the kind of person who's just gonna sit in the audience and listen to lectures. He brought his camera, and he decided to take pictures of each of the presenters in turn, providing them a little bit of value, getting his foot in the door, and starting off the amazing luck that would define the rest of his career. So you might call Garry Tan lucky. He was lucky with his first company, and then he was lucky with all those other investments. But what do you call someone when they're lucky over and over and over again? I think a better way of understanding Garry is to say that he's both lucky and ready. That's why he's been such a central figure in Silicon Valley in the past, and that's why he'll continue to be central in Silicon Valley in the future. Hey everybody, CK here. Hope you enjoyed the episode. This is actually our first episode that is sponsored, and fittingly, it's sponsored by a Y Combinator company, TrueWind. TrueWind is an AI-powered finance and accounting tool that helps startups and SMBs close their monthly books. Their customers love that it's accurate, but they also love that TrueWind helps them close their books faster in days, not weeks. So whether you're a finance manager or a founder, reach out to TrueWind and see what they can do bringing generative AI to your finance stack.